The lasting power of a literary work is always a curious and unpredictable thing. What could be popular at the time could be nearly unheard of years later. But these literary works have had their impact on popular culture whether people know it or not. Because we do not live in a vacuum, everything we ever create owes its lineage to something else. So, here's a sampling of authors and their enduring influences on our popular culture. We start with William Blake, and like it or not, nearly everyone can recognize at least one of his poems. While his poetic techniques may be lost on students just trying to pass that AP literature test, his works are still known today for a reason. His name alone is enough to recognize him at least as that one guy who writes all those complicated poems about chimney sweeps, or something. And also he's an important plot point in that one Johnny Depp movie, I guess? Next we move on to the queen of popular culture, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. She's an author that needs no introduction since the name Frankenstein alone is recognizable by people of all ages. Since its initial publishing in 1818, the book has never been out of print. Think about that for a second. That book has been printed for nearly 200 years without any kind of pause. That alone should be a testament to its lasting power. On top of that, Frankenstein's monster has become one of the quintessential monster stereotypes of pop culture. If I was ranking these authors on their influence on pop culture, Shelley would be no further than second place with a hard bargain for first. John Keats is known for his haunting poetry that grapples with the very nature of death and eternity, as if knowing that he would die at the tender age of 25. It's actually incredibly impressive the kind of work he was putting out, and his most famous work, Ode to a Nightingale, is one that people recognize the name of, if not the content. His influence on the literary hemisphere is much larger than his on pop culture, but he makes the list anyway, since his poetry is still widely recognizable. Elizabeth Barrett Browning is another poet, but her reason for being here is less about any individual poem and more about the fact that she wrote one of the most popular and well-known lines of poetry in the English language. Sonnets from the Portuguese 43 contains the line, "How do I love thee, let me count the ways." Lewis Carroll deserves a mention here because his works are very much still popular. The Jabberwocky is one of my personal favorite poems, and many people will recognize some of its silly lines or its name, or at least that one sort that goes snicker snack. The poem may be great, but the work it's contained in is much more famous. If Disney picks up something, it's going to stay in the popular cultural sphere for a little while. On top of that, there have been many adaptations from movies to video games and even to manga, as Alice in Wonderland is a surprisingly popular work to base media on in Japan, showing that his work extends even beyond Carroll's homeland of England. Speaking of popularly adapted fiction, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes is much in the same boat as Shelley's Frankenstein. The character of Sherlock Holmes has persisted and is still being made into adaptations that garner the kind of fan following that mirrors Doyle's original works in their reception. No, really, he killed Holmes off and got letters sent to him about how terrible he was. Doyle actually hated Holmes and preferred writing historical fiction, but had to bring him back when he needed a quick buck. I'd put him right up there with Shelley in terms of longevity and impact, even if he probably wouldn't want it. James Joyce holds the legendary status of writing really complicated things that no one understands. That isn't exactly what you'd expect from a novel that includes such riveting intellectual thoughts such as what if I had a penis, but that's the mythos that's built around Ulysses anyway. That's not to say that it's an easy read, but it's certainly more human than we make it out to be. Joyce's works have been adapted into film, radio, and even musicals. Finnegan's Wake is infamous for being even weirder because it's highly symbolic and isn't even written entirely in standard English. Talk about mind-boggling. Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway is probably one of her most influential works, spawning novels, movies, and movies based on novels based on the original novel. Got all that? Good. Mrs. Dalloway is written in stream of consciousness, a style also famously used by Joyce, and is one of the most famous examples of this narrative style. Interestingly, Woolf also has a presence outside of her work, being famous for her feminist writing, depression, and ultimately her suicide. Poignant suicide note and all. She's one of the figures we look to when romanticizing suicide purely because hers seemed so poignant, but that's a discussion for a different time. Honorable mentions go to T.S. Eliot, famous for the line, "This is the way the world ends, not with a bang but with a whimper," and Ted Hughes for his novel The Iron Man, which served as the basis for The Iron Giant, which is probably one of the most underrated animated movies I've ever seen. So there we go. That was a sampling of the authors that are most visible in our current popular culture. Certainly, popular culture can forget many brilliant works, but there is something to be said about the kind of popularity and longevity that comes with persisting in the media sphere for so long.